Please be seated.
Thank you. Your Honour, I call Dr Peter Evans, who's in fact already come forward to the witness box.
Doctor, it's necessary for you to be sworn to tell the truth. Will you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
Affirmation.
Would you stand for me, please, and repeat after me? They're still coming. If you would repeat after me, I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission.
That the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat. Yes, Mr. Freed.
Thank you, Your Honour. Can you state your full name, please?
Peter John Evans.
And Dr Evans, you've provided a statement to the Commission dated the 18th of February 2016, is that right?
That's correct.
Your Honour, I tender the statement.
It'll be Exhibit 28146.
Doctor, you're a qualified psychiatrist?
Yes.
And you worked as a consultant psychiatrist between the years of 1973 and 2010.
Correct.
You also trained as a Franciscan priest and were ordained in 1967 as a priest in the Order of Friars Minor.
Correct.
But you decided at the end of 1975 to leave the priesthood and the Franciscan order. Is that right?
Yes.
Just immediately before you left the order, you were posted, that is in 1974, to a place called La Verna in Kew.
Yes, La Verna is a Franciscan retreat house in Sackville Street, Kew.
And it was described as a retreat house, although you say in your statement it was undergoing a transition to what was called a house of spirituality.
Yes, it had for the previous 20 or 30 years, had been a retreat house in which retreats were conducted for the parishes of Melbourne on a regular basis. Following 1970 and the general social upheaval, many Catholics did not want a retreat. They wanted personal counselling, personal spiritual direction. So the emphasis of the retreat house was changed from conducting group retreats to providing individual counselling and spiritual support.
And you, as you explain in your statement, you at that time were performing dual roles. You had a spiritual role focused at La Verna, and at the same time you were providing clinical treatment to people.
Correct.
Where was that at that time? Where were you providing clinical treatment?
Well, I did it at La Verna in most cases, or in many cases, others at St Vincent's Hospital and at Cabrini Hospital, where I had consulting rooms.
Thank you. And you say in paragraph 38 of your statement that one of the problems you encountered was that quite often people within the church would blur the lines between religious or spiritual problems on the one hand and psychiatric or psychological problems on the other.
That's correct. I can give you a good example of that with obsessive compulsive disorder, like compulsive hand washing. With regard to spirituality, people with scruples who are repeatedly trying to go to confession and all sorts of behaviours to diminish their guilt feelings, it presents as a spiritual problem, but in fact it is a psychiatric disorder, an obsessive compulsive disorder. That's the sort of thing that I had to deal with.
You also discuss in your statement at some length personality disorders. Are they things which belong in the category of psychiatric or psychological problems?
No, this is a problem that's very difficult for the lay community to understand. A psychiatric, a personality disorder is not a psychiatric disorder. A psychiatric disorder is a severe disturbance of functioning characterised by symptoms which the patient is desperate for relief. Personality disorders, of which there are about 10 or 11 in the current diagnostic manual, a number of those, or they all constitute the background to psychiatric illness. They are not illnesses in themselves, and many with significant personality disorders do not experience any symptom whatsoever, but they often engage in deviant behaviours behind closed doors, and their normal behaviour, day-to-day behaviour, looks perfectly normal.
I'll ask you some questions specifically about the treatment of pedophilia later, but is it the case that personality disorders are things you would classify as clinical rather than spiritual?
Yes.
And amenable to treatment in one way or another?
Sorry?
And amenable to treatment in one way or another?
Personality disorders, difficult. Some are very difficult to treat, particularly the antisocial personality disorders, under which category sexual abuse, the hardcore sexual abusers would fall.
Yes.
Very difficult to treat.
Thank you. You explain in your statement that Father Gerald Ridsdale came to see you at Laverna in late 1975.
Yes.
You had no prior knowledge of Father Ridsdale before that time?
No, I'd never heard of him.
And although this was never made express, you formed the firm conclusion in seeing Father Ridsdale that he hadn't come of his own volition, but someone had required him to attend.
Yes, that was clinically very obvious to me. He was passively aggressive. On the surface, passive-aggressive means that on the surface they appear perfectly compliant, but underneath are seething with hostility and resistance.
You assumed that it was Bishop Mulcairns who had required Father Ridsdale to attend?
I assumed that, yes.
But in fact, you never spoke to Bishop Mulcairns?
No communication whatever from Bishop Mulcairn.
And that's either before or after you saw Father Ridsdale?
Before or after.
So no written communication or
no written communication or no telephone communication.
Thank you. And was it conveyed to you either by Father Ridsdale or anyone else that you were seeing him to assess his suitability to do parish work?
No. The reason he was referred was because while he was a priest at Inglewood, an allegation was made against him of child sexual abuse, which he denied, and he was referred to see me, or came to see me, largely with symptoms of anxiety about being investigated and the challenge that might make to his priestly status. As I mentioned in that submission, I was leaving the Franciscan order within 4 weeks of first seeing him, and saw him on 4 occasions. After 1 or 2 sessions, I received a communication from the police, who was looking into the case. By the way, it was reported to the police. The exact mechanism I don't know, but the police were certainly investigating it, knew about it. The police informed me that they would not be pressing charges. However, the policeman added that they, I forget the actual word, felt, believed, thought he was guilty and would benefit from treatment. To which I replied, well, we'll do what we can. It's a retreat house, it's not a treatment centre, but he's welcome to come here. And Ridsdale knew that, but in retrospect, he was totally unmotivated for treatment.
So the sessions you had with him were unproductive from your point of view?
Sorry?
The sessions that you had with Father Ridsdale were unproductive? Unproductive,
yes. He revealed little information. I think you'll probably remember before this commission when he gave evidence, he said at one stage, I never told anyone anything, and that very much summed up his communication with me.
You have also seen from the evidence that Father Ridsdale has given and from documents relating to Bishop Mulcairns that one or both of them might have had the impression that the purpose of Father Ridsdale seeing you was to help him stop offending. Is that a fair description of what you understood to be the purpose?
No. It was his referral to see me was that an allegation had been made, the first one, and he denied it. So it wasn't, there was no concept in my mind at any stage that he was being referred for treatment of pedophilia. I had not made a diagnosis of pedophilia because I had no evidence to do so.
And at any point during this treatment, or these visits rather, or following them, did you convey to Father Ridsdale or anyone else that he was suitable for parish work?
I wasn't asked that question. The situation in my mind was this. He was functioning as a parish priest at Inglewood. An allegation was made. He denied it. It was investigated by the police. They did not press charges. And that was the end of the story.
You say in paragraphs 86 and 87 of your statement that given what you now know about what was going on and what had been previously going on, there was information that should have been given to you either by Bishop Mulcairns or the police or both,
yes,
about prior complaints.
They should certainly have given me that information if they knew it.
Yes.
And I don't know whether they did know it then. They certainly gave no communication to me.
Right. And you indicate in paragraph 87 that had information of that kind been available to you, you may have been able to discern that psychologically Father Ridsdale had a tendency,
yes,
to behave in that way.
That would have been a much more serious diagnosis. I would not need to have it proved if I had known that there were a series of multiple allegations against him. Action would have to be taken in that case.
So a series of complaints of sexual misconduct against children, are you saying might have enabled you to make a diagnosis of some kind?
I would have made the diagnosis unquestionably if he had serial complaints against him prior to that allegation at Inglewood. I would have certainly have regarded him as a danger to children and an established pedophile. In that situation, I would have sought advice with respect to reporting him, not to the local police who were looking into the matter, but to the Melbourne squad looking after sexual offences.
Is that a service you had had cause to use previously?
A course, not a course that I had used, but a course that I knew about. We had the advice of the Medical Practitioners Board with ready access to the solicitors there, and we discussed procedures that should be adopted and when police needed to be contacted and so on.
You explain in your statement that other priests were referred to you from time to time for different reasons. So during your time at Laverna, one other priest, a priest from Armidale in New South Wales, that is, was referred to see you because he had engaged in sexual contact with late adolescent boys. And you explain what happened with that priest. Is that the only occasion during your time at Laverna that a priest was...
They were the only two priests that had been referred to me ever. And that was in the last 4 weeks that I was at Laverna, and the latter one you mentioned was on the eve of my departure.
Thank you. You then spent some time overseas and returned to private practice outside the church.
Yes, I went to London immediately, or almost immediately on leaving the priesthood and the order. I went to London. Prior to leaving, I went through the process of laicization according to canon law within the Catholic Church. I didn't have to do that. Many priests who left didn't do that. When I left, or in the 30 years from 1970 to 2000, 55,000 priests left the priesthood throughout the world. And some went through laicization, some didn't. But I received my laicization while I was in London later that year.
Thank you. And when you returned to Australia, you were in private practice based in Melbourne, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you received a number of referrals through the Melbourne Archdiocese to see certain priests?
Yes.
Right? You explained, you recall referrals from Archbishops Little and Hart
Yes.
during that period. But there were no further referrals from the Ballarat Archdiocese?
No one from Ballarat, no.
Why was it, as far as you're aware, that you were... why priests were referred from the Archdiocese of Melbourne to come and see you?
Why they referred to see me?
Yes.
Well, I think the bishops knew that I'd been a Franciscan priest, that I was then qualified in psychiatry and a member of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, and that I might be a suitable person. I, in fact, didn't regard myself necessarily as a suitable person or any more suitable than any other psychiatrist, and made it known that that was my view, that these matters did not necessitate my past history of being a priest. But nevertheless, they did refer them to me, and I accepted them. Most of the priests were boundary violators, rather than, that is, priests that had entered into a sexual relationship with a woman with whom they had a duty of care.
Yes. You give two instances where priests were referred to you from the Archdiocese of Melbourne against whom allegations of child sexual abuse had been made, and those allegations related to activities in the 1990s and 2000s.
Yes.
Are they the only two instances?
They're the only two that I can recall, and I think I would recall others. The others I explained were all boundary violators and hadn't abused children.
Thank you. And in those circumstances where you were asked to see the two priests that you refer to in your statement, were you expressly asked to express a view about their suitability to remain?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. And you describe in paragraph 95 of your statement the circumstances in which, in your view, a priest who is engaged in child sexual abuse may be amenable to effective therapy. Is it fair to say it's only in quite narrow circumstances where a number of conditions apply, including willingness of the priest in question to receive treatment, an admission of guilt and amenability to therapy? Those are necessary preconditions to effective therapy.
Yes. If I could expand on that in answer to your question, from a clinical point of view, there were three groups of priests who were involved in child sexual abuse. The more serious group we called the core sexual abusers, the Ridsdales. They had significant personality disorder. Most of them lacked, with a serious antisocial personality features, lacked the concept of empathy. That is, they were unable to perceive the effect of their behaviour on other people, and they had really no insight into the nature of their behaviour. They are far more difficult to treat, almost impossible. They need to be in jail. If they were not in jail, they would need, in my opinion, what is popularly called medical castration, but it's not castration, it's the use of medication to suppress their sexual drive, because it's very difficult to treat them out of jail. In fact, it's almost impossible to stop them acting out. And in my clinical opinion, the only way to do it with these hardcore sexual deviants is to treat them with medication suppressing their sexual desire, not permanently, but at least for as long as it's necessary for them to learn to control behaviour. The other group,
sorry, yes.
The other group were a group of more soft-core pedophiles who did things like, often with families with whom they had a very friendly relationship, often sleeping in the family home and then touching the genitals of one of their children. They usually felt quite guilty about it immediately and would go to confession and would be very willing to have treatment. They were amenable to treatment, provided you curtailed their faculties or got the bishop to curtail their faculties with respect to preventing them having contact with children. There are plenty of priestly work, ministry that can be done without contact with children. The third group are a more interesting group of homosexuals who have come into the priesthood and or religious life, who obviously had homosexual fantasies in adolescence and then have entered religious life only to find that once the constraints of seminary training were lifted, that their homosexual fantasies started to take effect and they would engage in sexual relationships or sexual behaviour with adolescent, usually late adolescent boys. My approach to those priests was, it's not for me to tell them to leave the priesthood, but I would bring up the matter that they should seriously consider leaving the priesthood and dealing with their homosexuality in a rational manner.
Thank you. You indicate in your statement that back in the 1960s and 70s there was very little learning and very little research available relating to pedophilia. Is it fair to say that the approach you've just described and the three categories you describe reflects more recent learning within the field?
Yes.
And would you describe your position as an orthodox one within psychiatry?
Yes.
When would you date that kind of learning from?
In 1969, 1970, when I was training at the New South Wales Institute of Psychiatry, I was a priest then, there was very little teaching on the sexual deviancies. As I mentioned in my submission, a book by Anthony Storr in London, what was called The Sexual Deviancies, that was really the book that we used with regard to pedophilia, which we didn't have a great deal of training in, but nevertheless Anthony Storr said that this hardcore sexual deviancy was rare, and the other softcore sexual deviancy was more common and more treatable. He didn't deal with homosexuality in that, except in a separate section. Yes. At that time, homosexuality was regarded as a deviancy, but times were changing, and subsequently over the next 10, 15 years, it was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as psychiatric deviancy, sexual deviancy, and regarded as a variant of human sexuality.
Thank you. And just focusing on the first category that you described of people who, aside from chemical treatment, you don't consider to be amenable to treatment, are they what you're alluding to in paragraphs 82 and 83 as personalities that are psychopathic or sociopathic?
Yes. Yes.
And is it the case that both sociopathic and psychopathic personalities...
Well,
I'm sorry.
Psychopathic psychopathic personality is a more general term. It's not the term used for the personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is the diagnostic term given to them. Right. They are the ones I mentioned earlier whose behaviour lacks human empathy and insight into the effects of it.
And denial is another key characteristic.
Massive denial. Masters of deception.
Thank you. You're aware that one of the criticisms, I'm here not focusing on abusers, but on the way abusers were managed within the church. One of the criticisms is that abusers were moved from one parish to another in circumstances that might have put people at risk. You're aware of that as a criticism of the way?
I'm certainly aware of that. Look, I think that is related to a very misguided idea in the Catholic Church that somehow or other these problems are spiritual in nature, and that if they said their prayers, said their office and did all the other things that priests are supposed to do, it would all go away. It doesn't.
Right. So you don't put that conduct down to a lack of empathy or denial on the part of the authorities?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't think it was a malicious denial. I think it was a gross ignorance and almost psychological illiteracy.
And I take it from what you said a moment ago, you think it reflected also a belief that these were spiritual problems with spiritual solutions?
Which was a spiritual problem?
Well, the misconduct by these priests was a spiritual...
Well, I think some of the bishops regard it as really just straying from the path of their normal priestly activity and behaviour, which is quite complex, what a priest should do to maintain his priestly life. And they thought that if everything was done properly, that things would settle down.
You refer in your statement to other psychiatrists and psychologists who you were aware of treating priests during this period, and you mentioned Father Augustine Watson, who was using something you describe as logotherapy. Can you just please expand a little on what was involved in logotherapy and Father Watson's techniques as far as you understood them?
Yes. Father Watson was a Franciscan priest. He was theoretically... I was superior of the house at La Verna. He was theoretically a member of my community. But he was a maverick in the sense that he pursued an individual way of thinking and treating, and really didn't participate or follow the normal behavioural patterns and of the order. Now, that might sound strange to those here, but in fact the order was quite tolerant. The Franciscan order was quite tolerant of those who were maverick in their approach, provided they weren't doing any harm and were doing good. With regard to doing good, if you question me about that and logotherapy was a therapy designed along spiritual lines. It was really suitable for people who did not have severe mental disorders or severe psychiatric disorders, but had maybe problems of character trait, and it could be resolved in a form of spiritual therapy which amounted to or which involved the meaning of life. It was a 1970s therapy. It was really not mainstream psychiatric treatment for severe disorders.
But did Father Watson, as far as you know, consider it to be a technique that was effective to cure people of, for instance, paedophilic tendencies?
He never spoke to me about it, and a matter of fact, I only met him on one or two occasions, even though we belong to the same order. I think he probably believed that something could be done with logotherapy for core sexual abusers. I mean, my opinion would be absolutely not.
When would you have formed that conclusion as a professional that those...
When I was training in psychiatry.
So from the first time of your psychiatry you would have...
Oh yes, we looked at the variance of various therapies and their efficacy and what indications each therapy might have. It's a mistake to think that any therapy you have will treat everything that exists.
And about what year was that, when you were training and learning those things?
Sorry?
What year was that when you were learning and training? You were training and learning those things?
Most of the training was in psychodynamic psychotherapy. That's a transference-based therapy. Would you like me to expand on that?
When was that occurring? When did you have that training?
1969 to 1973.
And by then, you being, of course, within the church, was it known within the church that there was significant problems with priests?
At that stage, no. As I mentioned earlier, I'd never heard of a priest abusing a child before Ridsdale was referred to me.
So the training that you were getting was, as it were, without identifying any particular source of offending?
That's correct.
Dr. Evans, earlier in your evidence, you indicated that in reference to Father Ridsdale, that if you'd come to an understanding, and I think it was with respect to item 87 of your statement, if you'd come to an understanding he was a serial abuser, you would have felt ethically obliged to report him to the Melbourne Police.
Yes.
And that ethical obligation arose because of the advice you had received from the Medical Practitioners Board and those authorities. In item 102, you make the point that, and I quote, "To my knowledge, Father Watson was not a member of the Australian Psychological Association."
That's to my knowledge.
In your view, would that excuse him from the ethical obligation that you felt you were bound by? To report to the police a serial abuser?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. I thought it would be an obligation on anyone who was a therapist to report the police something that was a serial and serious offender because of the present danger to other children.
And you held that view from very early on in your practice?
Well, we were taught that in training with respect to pedophiles in Long Bay Jail. All the pedophiles that were presented to us, not clinically, we didn't see any of them, but their case histories were all in jail, and the personality profile of them was that they came from a background of dysfunctional families, unemployed, alcoholism, and so on, and were really seriously impaired personalities.
So to be precise, would you have felt you were under that obligation, that ethical obligation, in the 70s and the 80s?
In the 70s, the 80s, I would, if, one, the parents or of the child, say, wanted it reported to the police. Most of them didn't want it, and I can expand on that if you would like. Most of them didn't want it reported to the police. And the other proviso was that there was no present danger to other children.
Thank you. Doctor, at the end of your statement, you expressed some views about what factors do you consider to be relevant to explaining why there is a significant number of pedophiles, or why there have been historically a significant number of pedophiles within the Catholic Church?
Yes.
You say in relation to celibacy as a factor that it is a factor but neither a necessary nor a sufficient one, in the sense that it's not necessary because there are pedophiles in the community who don't take a vow of celibacy.
Yes.
And it's not itself a sufficient factor because obviously there are a large number of priests and nuns and religious who take a vow of celibacy but don't become pedophiles.
Correct.
But nevertheless, in your opinion, it is a factor in part because a vow of celibacy might have attracted or might attract a sexually deviant but pious Catholic youths into the ranks. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I could explain it a little more clearly. I think that the first point is that sexual deviancy does not arise in adult life. It begins in childhood and adolescence. It may manifest itself with actual acting out sexual behaviour in early adult life. But young men, young Catholic boys who may be quite religious and thinking of entering the priesthood, who experience sexually deviant fantasies, are quite disturbed because it's a mortal sin if they indulge in them, and eternal damnation were they to die in that state. This is what the Catholic Church is teaching, of course. So, granted they're religious, there's a they were drawn to celibacy as a means of coping with, suppressing their sexually deviant fantasies. And that works for a period of time when the social constraints of seminary training with its horarium, every hour of the day is appointed for doing something, there are prayers at specific times, it's a full day spelt out for them. That had the effect of containing a lot of acting out behaviour. And the celibacy then was almost an escape for them. And the unfortunate thing, of course, as soon as they get into, as soon as those external constraints are taken away, I mean the social structures, the acting out behaviour tends to emerge. I could say a lot more about that. And I would like to say a bit more with respect to Mr. Andrew Murray's very pertinent question to Brother Brandon about why does the Christian brothers have such a over-representation amongst deviants, sexuals? Would you like me to expand on that?
Yes, please.
All religious orders of men particularly, and in the 60s and 70s, and particularly the teaching orders who had access to large numbers of boys, promoted their juniorate in their adolescent years. They had, as it were, a captive audience of young men. These young men, young adolescents, in that period of their time, are going through enormous changes in psychosexual development and personality development generally, and their brain is being reshaped, reconnected, reformed in countless ways. They are highly suggestible during those periods of years. That's the time when they are amenable to radicalisation. It is a tragedy that the Catholic Church condoned its selection of priests and religious from adolescent young boys during this period of time, because it impairs their psychosexual development. It leads to a failure to properly develop psychosexually. It's not at all surprising to us psychiatrists that when that happens, then it's only a matter of time when they are released, when they emerge into early adult life, that their sexual behaviour is acted out. and it's acted out in a distorted way by sex with young boys. Now, the Christian Brothers, amongst all the religious orders, had a greater number of young men that they enlisted into their juniораtes, and they had enormous numbers of boys available to them. So it's not at all surprising to me that the Christian Brothers are vastly overrepresented in the sexual abuse of young boys. One, because of their selection at a premature age, the suppression of normal psychosexual development, and the emergence in adult life or early adult life of deviant sexual behaviour.
So, Doctor, you allude to that, I think, in paragraph 119 of your statement, the outrageous practice of enlisting young adolescent boys having been abandoned. And the last question I wanted to ask you is about the other matter you suggest in paragraph 119, was that, in your opinion, if the Catholic Church embraced optional celibacy, it would be of great benefit psychologically. Yes. Can you just perhaps explain a little more about that?
Well, as I explained, compulsory celibacy carries with it the problems that I described earlier of more likely to encourage the suppression of deviant sexuality by embracing celibacy. If there were optional celibacy, I would think most of those young men would not probably embrace a celibate life, but they'd still be a problem in society, and that's another problem to be addressed. But the optional celibacy, there's no reason whatever why the Catholic Church can't have optional celibacy. It has married priests in Melbourne now, and the Maronite order are all married. All their priests are married, and most of them married. So there are plenty of traditions in the Catholic Church for married clergy. There's absolutely no reason why the Catholic Church can't have optional celibacy tomorrow.
Thank you, Doctor. Nothing further.
Doctor, just a couple of questions. In paragraph 106, you say all female religious are also celibate but are not sexual abusers.
In general.
I was going to say,
there will be
we, the Royal Commission, know that not to be universally true, but
yes.
You're not suggesting that's...
No. But number-wise, it's much less.
Secondly, 107, you say, without there being evidence of sexual abuse in the past, earlier times. The Church, of course, has had rules against sex with children for centuries.
Yes.
That rather suggests that someone recognised...
The whole of society.
I'm sorry?
The whole of society.
Yeah, I know, but the Church had its own rules about it.
Yes. Oh, yes.
That rather suggests the Church was aware that it needed to say something about that issue to those who were within the Church, doesn't it?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that the Church's teaching on sexual morality was encapsulated in 2 volumes called De Sexto et De Nono, which were written by an Italian theologian at the beginning of the 20th century, that outlined in great detail every sexual sin that you could imagine. So priests were trained in all the variations of sin. It doesn't necessarily mean that because the Church knew about it, it was quoted in that book.
I'm talking about rules applied to priests themselves.
The
Church had rules about that.
The rules about what?
Priests not having sex with children.
No. I think the Church had rules, if I may say, Your Honour, which were behavioural patterns to prevent the emergence of deviant sexual behaviour or any other deviant behaviour. They were the social constraints that were imposed upon the celibate clergy in order to prevent any possible acting out.
Are you aware of the history of the confessional?
I am.
The physical arrangements and how there was recognised a problem with the abuse of children in the confessional?
my approach to that, my opinion about that is hardcore deviants don't go to confession.
No, it's the priest, it's the abusing priest in the confessional. The history of the confessional tells us that the church recognised that children were being abused by priests when they went to confession. You're not aware? We need to go into the detail.
I'm aware of that accusation. The confession, prior to the Second Vatican Council, the era which I think you're referring to.
No, I'm going back centuries.
Well, even further back.
No.
But it was always in a confessional, with a screen, with a veil.
That's where the problem was. That's why the screen was introduced.
No, it wasn't.
Well, anyway, we won't go there.
We'll have to disagree with that.
There's books that have been written about it. Have you read any of those books?
Sorry?
There are books that have been written about this issue. Have you read any of them?
I've read quotes and extracts about it, but because a book has been written doesn't mean it's true.
Well, now's not the time to debate that. There's just one other thing I want to take up with you. You talk in paragraph 115 about the role of the Vatican Council and how priests' behaviour and relationship to the community changed.
Yes.
You're not suggesting, are you, though, that those changes led priests to abuse children as opposed to engaging in sexual activity with adults?
Yes, I am suggesting that if the said priest had the predisposition in the first place.
Well, how does
if he's the ones that I mentioned earlier that came in with having had sexually deviant fantasies in adolescence and had resorted to a life of celibacy. Now, strict church protocol and behavioural practice that were imposed upon priests can suppress that activity for periods of time, but it will emerge when those social constraints are weakened or removed.
What were the social constraints that suddenly released priests to have sex with children?
What social constraint would...
What were the social constraints, in your view, which released priests, when taken away, released priests to have sex with children?
Well, let me repeat what I said, Your Honour. The priest who has the young man who has sexual deviancy, thoughts, enters religious life, embraces celibacy, embraces the strict routine of religious and priestly training. If that were to continue, as it is in the seminary, and to some extent particularly in religious orders, it tends to keep their deviancy under control. What I've said is that after Vatican II, there was widespread reduction in the dress, behaviour, routine of priests. They became much more part of the community. There was a relaxation of the constraints of religious life. That is the situation I'm saying, where those, to that period of time, suppressed sexual deviancy emerges. We call it acting out.
I'm not sure I understand how it is. I mean, priests were trained before Vatican II. They were then sent out to their parishes to minister to the people in their parishes where they had access to children, access to families. And we, of course, have had evidence from people in private sessions long before Vatican II of abusing priests. What is it that suddenly allows or facilitates the priest to abuse children?
Well, I can only repeat what I've just said to you, Your Honour, that they already had a pre-existing deviancy that was suppressed by their training and emerged later in their...
I know.
Am I not explaining myself?
Well, that would seem to me to be a capacity that's in the priest, the deviant priest, irrespective of Vatican II.
No, it's in the priest, but what I'm talking... There are two things. Look, let me illustrate it this way. In this courtroom, there are practices, behaviours, all sorts of things which are used to contain human behaviour. If we did not have that here, you would get chaos. It's the same in the army. The army is trained with a strict discipline, but in times of war, often those discipline disappears and acting out an aggressive behaviour occurs. What I'm saying is that the Church has similar constraints upon behaviour, upon priests, and if those are relaxed, as they were following the Vatican Council, then any deviancy present in the priests prior to that time is likely to emerge, whether it's having sex with children, or whether it's boundary violations, or whether it's alcoholism, or whether it's gambling. All of those things occurred in greater numbers after Vatican II.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have one topic. Dr. Evans, my name is Hanscom. I'm here for a number of victims of clergy abuse. 6 of the people I represent were abused by Christian brothers. They were aged between 8 or 9 and 12, so they were pre-adolescent boys. That context is clear to you?
The context, what?
For whom I appear is clear to you?
Yes, yes.
I just want to explore possibly one additional factor that occurred, at least so far as the evidence here shows, in the Christian Brothers order. You've set out the factors that you consider go to the etiology of these behaviours in general in the Church, but I want to focus on something else. Would you accept the proposition that the more likely the child is to behave in a compliant manner, the easier it will be to abuse and to continue to abuse?
Absolutely. I mentioned that in my discussion, that the period of time they are extremely susceptible,
yes,
and suggestible.
And there are, I'm not talking about the trainee priests, I'm talking about the victims.
Yes, I realise that.
Yes. There are a number of ways you can render a child compliant. You can groom the child. Yes? You agree with that?
Yes, I think grooming is the result of their suggestibility. It's easy to groom them.
And another way you can render a child compliant is intimidation and fear. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
We've heard a copious amount of evidence that, in particular with one brother, an established modus operandi was to physically beat the child or humiliate the child or both, reduce the child to tears, and then under the guise of comfort, engage in sexual misconduct. The mechanism of rendering the child compliant by first reducing him to tears enabled that behaviour. You agree with that?
Well, yes, but let me explain it a bit more. As I explained earlier in my earlier submission here, that with respect to the Christian Brothers and the fact that they were enlisted in a crucial part of their development, psychosexual development, and that early juniorate experience, which was like preliminary religious life, was enough to suppress proper psychosexual development. The psychosexual development becomes disordered, disorganised, disturbed, and in adult life they will act out their disturbed sexual behaviour by abusing, criticising, assaulting children.
I understand that. That's not quite what I want you to focus on. I already understand
To make it a little clearer then.
I'm putting a very simple proposition to you, that if you can render the child compliant by physical assault, by humiliation, or both, it is more likely that your sexual misconduct will be enabled. The child will submit.
Oh, yes, yes.
That's clear,
It's all
isn't
part
it?
and parcel of the same
Yes.
thing.
And the child will be less likely to report what has occurred. A child rendered compliant, if he's told to stay quiet, he probably will stay quiet. Agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes, but that's the same thing that's happening in families. I mean, I know the Commission is looking
We're
at...
not concerned here with families.
But I'm using it as an example. Can I use it as an example?
Well, I'd rather you just stuck at the moment to this topic if you...
And I can come back to the example then.
Well, that's a matter for the Commission.
Well, we'll ask him.
So the last proposition I want to put to you is this, therefore, that in a school environment which, if not encourages, at least permits violent physical punishment as a method of discipline, it is more likely that the sort of behaviours we've seen will have been enabled and continued and kept quiet. Do you agree with that?
As a result of physical punishment, is that what you're saying?
Severe physical punishment.
Severe physical punishment. I would regard the severe physical punishment as a manifestation of the disturbed psychosexual upbringing that I described earlier.
I understand that, but would you agree with me also that that technique of rendering children compliant enabled the sexual acting out as well?
Oh, yes, yes.
So in a school environment where teachers are permitted to seriously assault children, it is unsurprising to see that they may go on to sexual abuse.
Well, I think you're just repeating what I've already said.
The Commission, please.
Doctor, there's just one further question I need to ask you about this Vatican II issue. What is your evidence that leads you to the conclusion that it was Vatican II that let loose the priests to abuse children if they had deviant tendencies? What's the evidence?
What is the evidence? Yeah. The evidence is what I saw with my own eyes and the many priests that I know and the priests to whom I spoke.
And the evidence from them is what?
The evidence is that as a result of the general fresh air that the Vatican Council was designed to give to the Catholic Church, led to a decline in the strict observance that we had our debate about earlier, and that all priests, myself included, remember very well during the 70s, when within 2 or 3 years of the Vatican Council, wearing jeans and no dog collar and maybe a little cross on your collar and...
I understand all that, but do they say to you, Doctor, the reason I started to commit these crimes was because Vatican II freed me up to wear ordinary clothes?
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, then what is the evidence upon which you base your opinion?
Well, the evidence is that it didn't occur anywhere near the extent that it is when those strict observances were in place.
How do you know that?
Well, I know that from the... Well, is there any evidence that they did?
Well, the problem with that, and it's one of the problems we face, is that the people who might tell you now about earlier times are going to be dead. You see, we just don't know. We know what the history books in relation to the church and other institutions record, but we've got no way of telling, do we?
Well, not knowing is no evidence.
Oh. All right, well, I think we'll leave that one there too. Mr. Free, sorry. Mr. Duggan, do you want a question?
Thank you. Dr. Evans, my name is Duggan and I appear for Cardinal Pell in this inquiry.
Yes.
You've given some evidence that in late 1975 you had 3, maybe 4 sessions with Gerald Ridsdale.
Yes.
And you've also given some evidence that after 1 or 2 sessions with Father Ridsdale, you received a call from a policeman.
Yes.
And the effect of your evidence about that is that the policeman told you that Gerald Ridsdale was being investigated for child sexual abuse.
Yes.
And communicated to you that that policeman thought or felt that Gerald Ridsdale was guilty. Is that correct?
Yes.
But also communicated to you that the police were not pressing any charges.
Correct.
Did the policeman explain or say to you why?
No.
No further questions. Thank you, Dr. Evans.
Commission pleases. Dr. Evans, my name's Shaw. I appear for 2 survivors of sexual abuse.
Yes,
Andrew Collins and Stephen Woods.
Sure, you'll need to make sure that microphone's picking
I'll
you.
pick it up. I'll start again. Dr. Evans, I appear for 2 survivors of sexual abuse, Andrew Collins and Stephen Woods. In your professional opinion, is it appropriate for a treating psychiatrist or psychologist or even a counsellor to treat or counsel both a paedophile priest or religious and the victim of that person?
No.
That is an unequivocal no?
Shouldn't be done.
That would be a breach of professional guidelines?
Yes.
It would indeed be professional misconduct?
Professional misconduct. I don't know about professional misconduct before the Practitioners Board. I think it's not possible to do therapy with a victim and a perpetrator.
It would have, apart from any impropriety, it would have a completely adverse effect on the treatment of both people, wouldn't it?
Impossible to do.
Even if the psychiatrist or psychologist or counsellor disclosed the fact to the parties?
Yes.
Wouldn't make any difference, would it?
No.
And I take it, therefore, you've never done such a thing? You've never done such a thing?
No.
And if you heard of anyone doing it, you'd advise them not to?
None of my colleagues would dream of doing it, I think. It's almost, something we were taught not to do.
And you would consider it an extremely improper thing to do?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
No one else?
Yes, I have some questions, Your Honour. Dr. Evans, my name is Gray and I appear for the Truth, Justice and Healing Council and for the Diocese of Ballarat and for the Christian Brothers.
Mr. Gray, that microphone's not doing too well.
My name is Gray and I appear for the Truth, Justice and Healing Council for the Diocese of Ballarat and for the Christian Brothers. I wanted to tease out a few of the topics that you deal with in your statement. The first is this. You mentioned that between 1969 and 1971, when you were training in psychiatry, you had some limited training in the diagnosis and management of the sexual deviancies.
That's correct.
And you mentioned 2 of those sexual deviancies as understood at that time as being pedophilia and homosexuality.
Yes.
What are or were other sexual deviancies, as that term is understood in psychiatry?
Things like fetishes, sadomasochism, and so on.
Right. So homosexuality at that time was regarded as a sexual deviancy.
Yes.
And indeed was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
Mr. Gray, we've covered this ground. Where are we going?
Well, if Your Honour will allow me...
He's already given evidence about this.
I'm attempting to elucidate more than what is in the statement.
Well, perhaps we can go to that point.
That's what I'm doing, if I may. Nowadays, however, homosexuality is regarded not as a deviancy but as a normal variant
Correct.
of human sexuality. And you mentioned that change that I've just mentioned had been achieved by about the early 80s. In the 1970s, research was being done, you say, to determine whether it was possible to change the sexual orientation of a homosexual.
Yes.
But you mentioned that no research was being done at that time, that is the 70s, with regard to changing the sexual orientation of pedophiles.
To the best of my knowledge.
So in the 1970s, as you understood it, was it thought or believed that, say, a priest who was homosexual could be referred for treatment for homosexuality?
Yes.
Was it, as you understood it in the 1970s? No, I'll come back to that. I'll withdraw that. Now, you also mentioned that in the 1970s, the extent of sexual abuse of children was unknown.
Yes.
And that applies, I take it, not only to the psychiatric world, but to the community generally.
The community generally, yes.
Indeed, in paragraph 58 of your statement, you mentioned that until Ridsdale came to see you in late 1975, early 1976, you had never heard of a priest sexually abusing children.
No, I hadn't.
And I take it you'd never heard of a religious, such as a brother,
no,
sexually abusing children. And you say that such a thing at that time, let's say late 75, early 1976, seemed to you unthinkable.
Yes.
And as you understood it, was that a widely held position at that time?
I can only answer that by saying that the priests with whom I mixed, colleagues, were of the same view as I was. Now, that does not mean that there were things hidden from our view, but that was our view. Basically, it means that I couldn't believe that a priest would do it, frankly, at that stage.
Now, the Commission has heard evidence in May last year from another psychiatrist, Professor Quadrio.
Yes.
Of whom no doubt you've heard.
Yes.
And she gave evidence at page 8448 in May last year that prior to 1991 was the dark ages for psychiatry, in the sense, as she explained, psychiatry was just as much in the dark as the general community, assuming that it didn't happen in religious organisations and so forth. Do you agree with that?
I would agree in part, not agree with the timing. I think it was probably earlier than 91, you said, did you?
That was the date that she happened to give.
Yeah,
what would be the timing in your view?
I would have thought more mid-80s.
But prior to, let's say, the mid-80s, would you agree with her characterisation of psychiatry being just as much in the dark as the general community, assuming that it didn't happen in religious organisations?
Yes, I think that's probably true, although I was aware by that time that it could happen in religious organisations, but I don't know that many of my colleagues were.
I'd like to show you something that Professor Quadrio has said in another forum, provided this document to the Commission. Now, as you can see, this is a talk by Dr. Quadrio given on the 18th of September 1997 about child sexual abuse. There's only one passage that I want to take you to, but on the first page it's mentioned that she had been working in the field of child psychiatry since 1973. The page I wanted to take you to was the one numbered 11.
Yes.
And halfway down the page, just at the end of the long paragraph that's on the top half of the page,
The one entitled Question?
just above the word question, the last three lines of the material before, Professor Quadrio is saying, I don't think psychiatrists have done anything to stop the war being a reference to the child abuse problem. And I think legislators and lawyers are going to do something to stop it more so than psychiatrists and doctors. And then you see there's a question, which apparently was, about educating ordinary people to recognise the signs of abuse. And the answer that the professor gave was, well, that's the whole point about educating ourselves. If it doesn't exist in your mind as a possibility, then you won't see it. And she says, exactly.
Yes.
She goes on to give an example in relation to herself. She says when she first became a psychiatrist, which was about 1973, she worked in a big hospital like Ridsdale, a psychiatric hospital. And she says, it did not exist in my head as a possibility that a staff member would sexually abuse a patient. It was just no one had ever said to me that this could happen. It didn't occur to me that this could happen. It didn't occur to me that this could happen, so it didn't exist in my mind as a reality. See that?
Yes.
She says that she looks back and she wonders how many times she was told that a patient had gone mad during the night, and she wonders how many times that person went mad during the night because she'd been raped. And it never occurred to her, Dr. Quadrio, in her wildest dreams, when she was working as a psychiatrist in those days, that any patients could possibly be raped by a member of staff.
Yes.
Now, do you agree with her proposition, which is, if it doesn't exist in your mind as a possibility, then you won't see it?
Yes, I do. And a good example of that is the AIDS epidemic. When AIDS first came on to the scene, we in medicine did not have AIDS on our differential diagnosis list, in which case it was, for quite a period of time, missed or not understood at all that a human immune virus could be transmitted from a primate to human beings.
So would this be right, that in the 1970s and 80s, and obviously also earlier than that, the kinds of things that might today be recognised as red flags or warning signals in relation to child sexual abuse may well not have been recognised as such?
I think that's true. And when I reflect back on those times, there was very little in the media. There was nothing on television that I can recall. I don't remember many court cases on the matter. There was a widespread ignorance of it in society general, right across the board, not just psychiatry, but in the law, in the media, everywhere. And it was partly related to this massive secrecy that is engendered by sexual deviance, which occurs...
Sorry, go on.
Which occurs also in the family, a much greater percentage than this Commission is dealing with.
We'll come to that briefly later, but just picking up that point about secrecy, you mentioned in your statement that pedophiles rarely, if ever, refer themselves for treatment.
No, nor do criminals, murderers, and all the other, variants of criminal behaviour.
And you mentioned that denial is their own primary defence mechanism.
Denial, yes, it is.
And what about their secrecy, their concealment of abusive behaviour?
Well, they're masters of deceit.
You mention in your statement at paragraph 16 that deviant behaviour, which of course includes pedophilia,
yes,
takes place behind closed doors.
Yes.
How skillful are such people, such as people engaging in child sex abuse, at concealment, at disguising their actual behaviour?
Well, I think it's extraordinary in their capacity to maintain secrecy. I know of very few that have been caught in flagrante delicto.
Sorry, that have brought in
In the act.
I'm sorry. In flagrante delicto is what I said.
Thank you. I just didn't.
It means in the very act of committing the sin.
So is secrecy part of the pathology of a pedophile?
Yes.
Is it possible, for example, that someone could share a house with such a secretive abuser and have no idea that that abuser was doing those things?
Well, I hear the response in the audience, but the fact is, what you say is true. And the reason is, or one of the reasons is, or one of the examples is, that most wives do not know that their husbands are having sex with their daughters.
What would you say to the suggestion that a headmaster of a school in the 1970s should have known of child sexual abuse being carried out by teachers at his school, even if, let it be assumed, he did not actually know of such a thing happening?
The question of whether someone should have known something goes back to the question you asked earlier from Carolyn Quadrio. It needs to be on the radar in some way. It needs to be seen as a possibility to be considered. Otherwise, generally, we're not aware of these things. We're not on the lookout for them.
Just a couple of other things I wanted to...
But just to pursue that point briefly, so if a headmaster or a teacher or a priest or a bishop had been directly told of these occurrences...
Oh, directly told, that's not what you're referring to, was it?
So if a bishop knew and had it reported to him
Yes.
that a priest had molested a child...
Yes.
It should therefore be on their radar, shouldn't it?
Yes.
Thank you.
Even though the priest would deny it.
Now, you mention in your statement, and you've mentioned briefly in the witness box, that while the Commission is investigating the institutional responses to sexual abuse against children, sexual abuse in the institutional setting accounts for only 10 to 15% of the cases of sexual abuse. Is that right?
That is the worldwide figure.
Is that a proposition, that statistic, if I can call it that, something which is the subject of consensus and agreement among professionals and in the literature?
Yes, it is.
Both in Australia and internationally?
Well, the figures quoted are international figures. The figures on sexual abuse generally would be in the region of that. The figures vary from about 3 to 37. The mean is 25%, which is 1 in 4. It's estimated that 1 in 4 females in Australia, that's 1 in 4 of 12 million, that is 3 million women, will be sexually abused in their childhood. And we in clinical psychiatry see it again and again when women presenting with psychiatric disorder in early middle age will give a history of sexual abuse in childhood, not by the clergy, but by their father, their brother, their cousin, their uncle, their grandfather. And that figures vary from psychiatrist to psychiatrist, from some 70%. My own experience would be about 35%.
Now, I want to pick up a different topic. You touch on the subject of confession in your statement, and you mention that deviancy such as desiring sex with children does not necessarily come to light in confession because such a deviant might simply confess to something euphemistic like giving into sexual thoughts or masturbation without elaborating on or revealing what had really happened.
Yes. Well, as I said, I don't believe that many of them go to confession, but if they were, they would almost certainly say, I've given in to sexual thoughts and I masturbated. The confessor is unlikely to say, well, please elaborate. It's just something that you don't do. It comes across as a prurient interest.
Now, you were yourself a priest for
yes,
some 8 or 9 years after your 7 years or so of training.
Yes.
And you heard confessions from time to time?
Yes.
Including from time to time from priests or religious?
Yes.
Did any priest or religious ever confess to you anything in the nature of sexual misconduct with children?
No. And let me say to the audience here, this is not breaking the seal of confession, which concerns about revealing the name, the who, not the what.
Yes, I understand that. Thank you. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you about confession is this. This is from your experience in particular as having been a priest. Where, hypothetically, some religious or priest were to have confessed to a confessor on one occasion something of a child sexual abuse nature, whatever it might be, what should, in your view, the confessor or priest do? And if you could then go on to elaborate on what should be the position if the same confessor heard the same admission from the same person on more than one occasion?
Right. The confession is a sacrament. It imposes serious obligations upon both the confessor and the penitent. Upon the confessor, it imposes the obligation to apply a penance which will deter the offence, the sin, from occurring again. Secondly, the penitent is urged to have a regular confessor for the very reason that you've just described, so that a penitent will not go from priest to priest saying the same thing or confessing the same sin. The priest would be obliged to encourage the penitent to come back to him for next confession. If a priest, if a confessor could see that no effort was being made by the penitent to overcome the particular sin, we'll call it, then the penitent would be at liberty to say, well, I cannot give you absolution.
The confessor would be at liberty.
The confessor would say, I cannot give you absolution. You must demonstrate this behaviour.
Now, I think
it implies, let me just add something to that, with regard to the obligations on the penitent. The penitent must have genuine sorrow. It's not sufficient just to say, I've committed the sin. they must be genuinely sorry for having committed the sin, and in their act of contrition must state that and state that it will not happen again. If they did that and were simply doing it as a almost to deceive the priest, that would be an invalid confession.
Now, you've mentioned that in the 1970s at least, perhaps into the 80s, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the view was held, both in the psychiatric profession and in the religious sphere, that people could be treated, as it were, for homosexuality.
Yes.
Was there a view, do you know, as to whether people could be treated in some way for sexual misconduct with children?
No. In the 1970s?
In the 70s or 80s?
Look, no to that. As I said earlier, all the pedophiles that we saw were in Long Bay Jail, where they were not being treated.
Yes, I understand that, but the tripartite
yes.
description that you described had not, I thought you said, emerged
No.
so early.
No.
And so in the 1970s, people who did not have that three-part breakdown but were dealing with someone who, for whatever reason, had apparently misconducted themselves sexually with a child, was there a view that that kind of behaviour, whatever its pathology or correct medical diagnosis was, could be treated in some way?
Look, I don't think that psychiatry had the treatment facilities for serial sexual behaviour at that period of time. In my view, it's not amenable to ordinary counselling. The centres that were established in the United States, in Canada and the United Kingdom were multidisciplinary treatment teams, not only for sexual deviancy but for a whole range of other personality-related disorders such as gambling and so on. They only came into existence in maybe the late 80s, 90s, and Professor Richard Ball was commissioned by the Catholic Church to visit those institutions in the United States, Canada, and to come back to Australia to set up a similar one here, which was the Encompass Institute at St Vincent's Hospital.
Just on those, three that have been mentioned in various ways in the Commission, St Luke's in Maryland,
Yes.
the South Down Institute in Canada,
Yes.
and the facility at Jemez Springs in New Mexico.
No, I've just forgotten the name of that, but there was one in New Mexico, yes.
Now, were you aware of them in the 70s or 80s?
No, look, I can't tell you the year in which I became aware of them. It probably would have been in the late 80s, I think, to the best of my knowledge. I can't recall exactly.
What can you say, if anything, about the programs that they offered, as to whether they were well regarded, as to whether they were seen as legitimate or the like?
Look, I think that they were seen as a genuine attempt of psychology, to treat these very difficult disorders. How effective they were going to be was something that only the passage of time could tell.
To what extent in the 1970s or 80s, in your view, was it reasonable to send a priest or religious who was engaging in some form of sexual conduct with children to any of those places?
I think it was appropriate. It was all that could be done. The only thing left.
Yes, thank you.
Your Honour, just one short matter. Doctor, you were asked those questions about what Dr Quadrio had said about if it doesn't exist in your mind as a possibility, then you won't see it. You remember that?
Yes.
just asking you to focus on your own personal experience, and you use the term "on the radar," I think, to describe the same concept.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that before Gerald Ridsdale came to see you in 1975, it was not on your radar that a priest might sexually abuse a child?
That's correct.
But after Gerald Ridsdale had come to see you, it was on your radar?
It was certainly a possibility, yes.
And the position was, as far as Gerald Ridsdale was concerned, you were told that he was being investigated for an allegation of abuse against a child?
Yes.
He denied that allegation?
Yes.
And you say in your statement you formed no judgment one way or the other about whether the allegation was true. Is that right?
I formed no...
You formed no judgment one way or the other?
About Gerald Ridsdale? No, a non-judgmental approach is what we were trained in. So I made no judgment about it.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Your Honour, if I could just ask one more question that I forgot to ask before. Just further to what I was asking about regarding ethical obligations. If a psychiatrist or psychologist or counsellor was counselling or treating a paedophile priest, if that priest was being investigated about the paedophilia behaviour...
Which means he was denying it, was it?
Well, let's say there was an investigation on foot. Yes, certainly.
I presume he was denying it, yes.
One would. Would it be appropriate for the treating psychiatrist, psychologist or counsellor to be involved in any way in the investigation, that is, assisting in the investigation?
No.
That would be unethical?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. That concludes your evidence. You're excused.
Thank you.
Ms. Finnis.
The witness is excused, I take it, yes. There are a number of matters to be tendered, and I think a list has been prepared.
Do you want to do that now or next week?
We can do it next week if you want to prefer. Then the final matter is, as Your Honour and the Commissioners are aware, we will be sitting at 8 a.m. on Monday morning until 12 p.m. in order to hear the evidence of Cardinal Pell, and I think there's been time set aside for 3, perhaps 4 mornings for that to happen. And just to indicate that the terms of reference for the Royal Commission provides that the work is to be done in a way that the need to ensure that evidence that may be received identifies particular individuals as having been involved in child sexual abuse or related matters is dealt with in a way that does not prejudice current or future criminal or civil proceedings or other contemporaneous inquiries.
Yes, thank you. Very well. We'll now adjourn until 8 a.m. Sydney time, as Ms. Finnis indicated. Thank you.
All stand.